The Titanic remained docked in Southampton for several days while finalizing the preparations for its maiden voyage. During that time, workers and officers checked equipment, supplies, and internal organization, ensuring that every section functioned with precision. The crew distributed tasks, the cargo managers supervised the movement of provisions, and the dock displayed a combination of port routine and anticipation for the departure of a ship considered one of the greatest achievements of the White Star Line. The morning of the boarding gathered passengers of all categories. Some arrived accompanied by their families, others assisted by employees, and many traveled alone toward their destinations. The staff organized access according to the assigned class, maintaining an orderly flow until near noon the maneuver was complete. Shortly after, the moorings were released. The Titanic advanced through the channel naturally, while from the deck the travelers watched the city that had witnessed their departure fall behind, without knowing what awaited them further ahead. But how terrifying would that be which they were about to face? Watchman in the shadow, the instant that changed everything. At the highest point of the ship, Frederick Fleet was fulfilling his lookout duty inside the post installed on the foremast. He was looking out at a night that was surprising for its clarity. The air was biting, the sky was clear, and the lack of a moon made the stars stand out strongly. The sea remained completely smooth, without a single visible wave. Those who remembered that night later agreed that the ocean looked like a polished surface. It was the 5th day of the maiden voyage, and the atmosphere among the passengers reflected that they were traveling on a ship considered the biggest and most striking of the era. Several people occupying the most exclusive areas even traveled with uncommon pets, but none of that had to do with Fleet's job. He was one of the 6 lookouts assigned to detect any sign on the horizon, and on that night he had been asked once again to be attentive to the ice. He had begun his shift at 10, and after commenting briefly with Reginald Lee about the cold and the possibility of encountering ice, both concentrated on the darkness. Most of the time they remained silent, looking forward while the wind struck the structure and the ship advanced at high speed in the middle of a still sea. Everything remained the same until 11:40 post-meridium approached. Suddenly Fleet noticed a dark shape directly in the route. At first it seemed small, but it grew quickly as the ship advanced. Immediately he rang the bell 3 times and picked up the telephone that connected with the bridge. When they asked him from the other side what he had seen, he responded clearly, "Iceberg right ahead." The voice that answered him acknowledged the warning without showing any emotion. During the following seconds, Fleet and Lee awaited the ship's reaction. The figure was becoming increasingly evident and rose many meters above the bow. When it seemed inevitable that the Titanic would collide head-on, the ship began to turn gently to port. The turn avoided the direct impact, but it did not prevent the starboard side from scraping against the ice. The white structure passed, pressed against the hull, and disappeared toward the stern. On the aft deck, Boatswain George Rowe noticed that something was altering the usual rhythm of the engines. First he believed that it was a sailing ship crossing on the right side, but immediately he understood that it was an enormous piece of ice that rose above the level of the upper deck. Below, in the first-class dining room, several employees were conversing after the last passengers had retired. The blow was light, only a tremor that made the dishes prepared for breakfast vibrate. One of the waiters believed that the ship had lost a propeller and mentioned that this would mean returning to Belfast for repair. In the galley, the night chief baker was preparing dough when he noticed a stronger impact. A tray was flung away and fell to the floor. For many people the jolt was slight, but for others it was more evident. In the cabins, several passengers woke up wondering what had happened. A young Swiss woman traveling with her father believed for a moment that the ship was docking in a port. A Canadian military man thought it was a strong wave. Lady Duff Gordon described the sensation as if someone had run a giant finger along the side of the hull. Others compared it to an abrupt movement, as if the ship had hit something while passing. Some barely noticed it, while others perceived a noise similar to a metallic tear. The blow also woke up J. Bruce Ismay, director of the company, who immediately sat up believing that the vessel had collided with some object. Passengers on different levels confirmed the same impression, a deep sound followed by a shudder that lasted barely a few instants. In a lower cabin, a married couple heard a snap, felt the ship vibrate, and observed from their window a mass of ice sliding along the exterior. Another passenger suffered something more disturbing. His porthole was open and fragments of ice fell inside his room when the hull scraped the iceberg. While the majority slept, some were still awake in the first-class smoking room. Known figures were conversing there, including assistants to the President of the United States, athletes and frequent travelers who were commenting on anecdotes about hunting and politics. Others were relaxing reading novels or participating in card games. Toward 11:30, some were feeling the cold entering from the lower decks and went up to this lounge to finish the night. Among hot drinks and cards, the atmosphere was calm until the friction against the ice interrupted the conversations. Several men stood up immediately and went out onto the deck. From there they observed how an enormous white wall moved pressed against the side of the ship, while small fragments fell into the water. After a few seconds, the block disappeared. Some returned inside, convinced that it was not a serious problem. The ship remained stable, and the cold made it difficult to stay outside. They resumed the game and served more drinks. But one of them noticed that the constant noise of the machines had ceased. Indeed, on the bridge, First Officer Murdoch had ordered the engines stopped. In the previous minute, he had given several instructions: turn the rudder completely, activate reverse gear, and close the watertight doors. The orders were executed quickly, but there was not enough time to avoid the scrape. When Captain Smith arrived at the bridge, Murdoch explained the maneuvers he had performed and confirmed that they had tried to dodge the danger, although they did not entirely succeed. The captain asked about the emergency doors, and Murdoch assured that they were already closed. In the boiler rooms, the situation was different. In compartment number 6, 2 workers were conversing when they heard the automatic closing signal. The subsequent jolt knocked down part of the side and the water entered forcefully. Both managed to cross the watertight door just before it closed. In the next compartment, the crack also reached the interior, and a jet of water began to fill the room. An employee was trapped among coal that had come loose with the impact, and another observed that the food he had left warming had spilled. Further back, in compartments that had not received the direct blow, the workers stood up surprised. Until that moment, the ship had been a comfortable assignment: new machinery, clean areas, and a less demanding work environment than on old ships. They commented among themselves that that vessel was a good assignment. That is why the blow disconcerted them. Many thought they had hit bottom in an area of shallow banks. Even when someone shouted that they had collided with an iceberg, several did not believe him. About 10 miles to the north, the third officer of the Californian was observing from his bridge the lights of a great steamer that was advancing quickly. On that night, his ship was stopped by the ice that was blocking the route. He saw how the other vessel approached, how its lights shone and how it overtook it. At 11:30, he advised his captain that he would try to communicate with it using light signals, but toward 11:40, he observed something striking. The ship that had passed so close stopped abruptly and seemed to turn off part of its lights. His first impression was that the vessel was simply reducing activity for the night, without suspecting that he had just witnessed the moment the Titanic scraped the iceberg. Scattered signals, the deceptive calm after the collision. Just as the scraping with the ice ended, life aboard continued as if nothing had happened. The lookout fleet resumed his shift, Mrs. Astor returned to settle in her bed, and Lieutenant Stephenson returned to his hot drink. In the second-class smoking room, the steward James Witter went out to check the tremor, but those who were playing cards barely looked up. It was Sunday, and the company almost never permitted games on that day, so they were taking advantage of the exceptional permission. In the reading room of the same category, the librarian, without receiving orders, continued reviewing the list of loans. In the hallways that led to the cabins, only distant conversations, doors closing far away, and calm steps were heard. Everything seemed to continue the same, although something intangible had changed. In his cabin, the young Jack Thayer was preparing for sleep when he noticed that the sound of the wind entering through the porthole suddenly stopped. 2 decks below, the producer Henry Harris was playing cards with his wife, who had an injured arm. Neither spoke much until she observed that her dresses, hung in the closet, had stopped moving with the ship's vibration. Further down still, Professor Lawrence Beasley was reading in his bunk when the slight oscillation of the mattress stopped. The silence that followed troubled more passengers than the impact itself. In a few minutes, warning bells began to ring, although the responses were vague. Beasley asked a waiter why they had stopped. The reply was a brief, "I don't know, sir, but I don't think it's anything serious." Mrs. Arthur Ryerson received a slightly clearer piece of information. A steward told her that there are reports of ice ahead, and that was why they had slowed down. She looked through the window toward the still sea and, seeing the calm night, decided not to wake her husband. Some were not satisfied. Colonel Archibald Gracie dressed meticulously and went up to the boat deck. Jack Thayer simply put an overcoat on top of his pajamas and announced to his parents that he was going out to see what was happening. On deck they found no drama at all, only dispersed groups looking out toward the darkness without identifying the source of any problem. The ship was floating without moving, while 3 funnels expelled steam with a deafening force that broke the calm. Near the stern, an elderly couple walked arm in arm, oblivious to the scattered conversations. The cold forced them to return inside. In the great first-class vestibule under the glass dome, several people who had left their rooms gathered. Their clothing formed a strange assortment. Robes, evening dress, fur coats, thick sweaters. The elegant architecture contrasted with the confusion that was beginning to arise. A waiter commented that they would soon be sailing again. By then, many already knew that ice had been touched. A second-class traveller returned to his cabin and told his wife that an officer assured him there was no danger. She was feeling unwell from dinner and preferred not to move. John Jacob Astor returned to his suite and explained what had happened with total calm. The reformer William Stead asked for the cause, and after the answer decided to return to his room to read. Another couple received the same explanation and got undressed again, although the tranquility was interrupted when a friend invited them to go out to see the ice. Between curiosity and skepticism, several passengers expressed the same desire to observe the piece that the ship had detached. However, minutes later, it was no longer about small remains of ice. Now the problem was manifesting inside the hull. Toward 11:50 post-meridian, strange sounds were heard in the first compartments. A technician in charge of maintaining the lamps heard a whistle in the area closest to the bow. It was air escaping under pressure due to water entering forcefully into the compartment where the anchor chains were stored. A chief stoker saw water in the area of the workers' cabins and in the hallway that connected that area to the furnaces. A third-class passenger felt how water was filtering under his door. When he finished getting dressed, it was already up to his shoes. Another jumped out of bed directly into a puddle. In the postal office, 5 employees were struggling to save the correspondence bags. The water was rising so fast that it passed from the lower to the upper level through the metal ladder that connected them. In a few minutes they completely abandoned the room, while several letters floated out of control. In the same section, the Chambers couple saw them. They had leaned out to see what was happening. Not even that scene convinced them that the problem was serious. At different moments, officers, assistants, and even the captain passed by there to later continue with their inspections. In boiler room number 6, where 2 workers had managed to cross the watertight door just in time, the water was already rising quickly. In the next room, number 5, even more men were moving among steam, tools and pumps that were trying to contain the ingress. Some were sent toward the deck to then receive the opposite order, remaining trapped between instructions that changed every minute. The lights went out, then returned. They put out furnaces to release pressure. The situation was chaotic, but they worked tirelessly. While that was happening, Captain Smith was trying to put all the information together. He had dedicated almost all his life to the company and enjoyed great respect. After the impact, he briefly inspected the stern to see if the iceberg was still visible. Then he sent Officer Boxhall for a quick review. Boxhall returned saying that he did not see damage in the area he was able to cover. It was the last positive news. Afterward, the captain asked them to locate the carpenter to measure the water. Before Boxhall could go down, the carpenter was hurrying up, affirming that the sea was entering forcefully. A mail clerk also emerged, assuring that the mail deposit was filling up. The president of the shipping company, J. Bruce Ismay, arrived at the bridge deck with the same uncertainty. He asked if the ship was badly damaged. Smith, after a moment of silence, admitted that he feared it was. They then called Thomas Andrews, the ship's designer, who had spent the entire day checking technical details and solving small faults. Andrews went down with the captain to the affected zones. In the interior corridors, the water had already reached several levels. The sea was hitting against the squash court. The panorama was clear. The first 5 compartments were compromised. When they returned to the upper part, Andrews explained the situation. With that amount of flooded compartments, the ship could not stay afloat. The calculation was definitive. The separation between the fifth and sixth compartment did not reach high enough, so the water would inevitably pass to the next, and then to the next. The progression was automatic. The myth that it was an invincible ship now had no way to be sustained. Smith heard that conclusion aware that he was facing a destiny impossible to reverse. At 12:05 post-meridium, he gave the order to uncover the boats, gather the passengers, and prepare the list of assignments. Then he walked to the radio room. There, Phillips and Bride were working exhausted after a day full of interferences and accumulated messages. The captain warned them that they might need to ask for help. A few minutes later he returned and confirmed the order. They had to send a distress signal. Phillips asked if he should use the official call. Smith said yes and gave the ship's position. At 12:15 post-meridium, the operator began to transmit CQD, followed by the identifying letters of the Titanic. A few miles away, Officer Groves of the Californian was conversing with Operator Evans, who had turned off his equipment minutes earlier, exhausted after unsuccessfully alerting about the ice. Groves tried to tune into something, but did not wind the mechanism of the receiver and did not hear any call. He left the headphones and walked away. It was the same moment in which the Titanic was asking for help in the darkness. Critical minutes, the ship that began to mobilize. The stillness of the Titanic was broken when several members of the crew began to walk the hallways, announcing that something was wrong. In the cabins of the cooks and waiters, the sound of a door banging woke up the staff. Second Steward Dodd, normally calm, burst in with a tone that none had ever heard from him before. He ordered them to get up without delay and announced that the situation was serious. The initial jokes disappeared as soon as the men grasped his expression. Some got dressed halfway, others put on the first thing they found. The order was clear: go up to the deck. Not everyone understood the scope of the warning. In another area, the trimmer Hemming returned to his bunk, convinced that the whistle he heard did not mean a real danger. He was about to fall asleep when a member of the technical staff appeared to warn him that water was already entering several sections. Right after, the boatswain transmitted a message attributed to Andrews. Little time remained, and they had to leave immediately. Despite the alarming content, the order was kept within the crew to prevent the rest of the ship from panicking. Meanwhile, in the first-class lounges, life continued as normal. In the smoking room, a group of men continued a card game, convinced that the interruption would be temporary. The calm was repeated in several cabins. Some passengers woke up because their husbands or relatives returned with news. Others opened their eyes when the steward on duty called discreetly to inform them that they should put on their life jackets and go out on deck as a precaution. The reactions were very different. There were those who got up without questions. There were those who took their time, thinking it was an exaggerated measure. In first class, many dressed carefully, choosing warm and elegant clothing as if they were going out for a nightly stroll. Several took small pauses to collect personal items, from jewelry to a book or a family souvenir. Every gesture reflected how they understood the situation. The differences between classes also became visible. In second class, many families went out with simple clothes, bundling up with what was at hand. In third class, the awakening was more chaotic. The men and women were on opposite decks, which generated confusion as they tried to reunite. Young people who had met other passengers during the trip ran through the hallways to notify those who were sleeping. Some refused to get up due to seasickness or tiredness. Others allowed themselves to be guided, still not fully comprehending what was happening. Little by little, the hallways filled up. People of all ages advanced toward the stairs, trying to remain calm. Some wore coats, others went out only in their nightclothes. There were those who carried bags with valuable objects, others carried nothing. The atmosphere mixed disbelief, curiosity, and a growing concern that no one openly expressed. Upon reaching the upper decks, many were surprised to see the movement of the staff. Some officers were coordinating access to the areas where the boats were, while the crew removed tarps, adjusted ropes, and prepared everything for a procedure that none expected to execute that night. In the first-class gymnasium, some passengers sat on the equipment waiting for new instructions, convinced that they would soon return to their cabins. On the boat deck, The officers were trying to establish order. The sailors removed covers, placed lanterns, and organized the necessary material. The years of routine were noticeable. Each one knew their function despite not having had a previous drill. The number of boats, however, was still less than the number of people on board, a fact that almost no one knew. Second Officer Lightoller, responsible for the port side, acted with strict discipline. He requested permission several times to prepare the boats, and seeing that the decisions were delayed, he sought direct instructions from the captain. The order was clear: women and children first. Even so, people hesitated to get into apparently fragile boats compared to the immense transatlantic liner. On the starboard side, First Officer Murdoch faced the same resistance. Some women refused to enter, others asked to stay with their husbands. The first boats took time to fill because many thought there was no real risk. The ship's band, located near the main staircase, played lively melodies that reinforced the feeling of control. The presence of Bruce Ismay, president of the company, generated tension. He insisted on accelerating the preparation while some officers ignored him. Among them, Fifth Officer Lowe, who arrived late to his post after having slept deeply, had a brusque exchange with him upon feeling that he was interfering with the sailors' work. Inside the ship, other characters began to notice disturbing signs. Some lower areas already showed currents of water advancing through the hallways. Several crew members quickly returned to deck after seeing levels rise from one compartment to another through internal stairs. In the boiler spaces, the engineers continued working amid steam and noise while trying to keep the pumps running. The medical personnel and the ship's correspondence handlers also perceived the seriousness. Brief comments among them showed that they understood that the situation was not a simple delay. However, they maintained a serene tone so as not to alarm the passengers. The builder Thomas Andrews moved tirelessly between decks. Seeing some without a life jacket, he insisted that they put one on. He spoke differently to each person, depending on what he believed was necessary to maintain calm or prompt action. He knew how damaged the hull was and how limited the ship's resistance was. While all this was happening in the radio room, Phillips and Bride continued sending distress signals. They received responses from ships at different distances, some very far, others without giving a precise location. The communication with the Carpathia was the most encouraging. It was coming at full speed, although it was still far away. At the same time, they tried to capture the attention of a ship they could see with the naked eye on the horizon, but without success. The captain ordered rockets to be launched to call the attention of the nearby vessel. Each explosion illuminated the night in a white flash that fell slowly toward the water. In the distance, an officer of the Californian observed the lights, without clearly interpreting that they were emergency signals. On deck, the boats finally began to descend. Some carried few people, others filled up more. The initial doubt gave way to a growing concern, although still dominated by the hope of a quick rescue. The confusion continued to spread throughout all classes, but the order was the same for everyone: stay on deck and prepare for what was coming while the officers struggled to complete the evacuation. Between boats and farewells, the moment to decide. In the boat deck, no one doubted the meaning of the rockets anymore. Each explosion illuminating the sky confirmed that the Titanic was urgently asking for help. Lawrence Beasley, a second-class passenger, understood it instantly. If a ship launched signals like that, it was not a simple setback. It needed immediate help. The atmosphere changed abruptly. The jokes and quiet chats were over. The farewells began to occur without time to extend them. Dan Marvin escorted his wife to the boat's side and threw her a kiss before backing away. Adolf Dyker did the same when helping his wife climb in. Others tried to transmit calm to those they were leaving behind. A doctor asked his wife to be brave no matter what happened. The gestures were brief and loaded with urgency, with gazes that lingered a few seconds before separating. Some couples sought a plan to reunite later, convinced that they would soon be rescued. Others tried to reassure their children or promised to find them in the next boat. In several cases, the women resisted getting in without their husbands. The scene was repeated throughout the deck: wives who wanted to stay together, husbands who tried to convince them to obey the order of women and children first. In certain cabins, the discussion even went down to the deck. Some couples returned to their room to talk about it privately before accepting the separation. In other cases, the insistence of the officers ended up prevailing. Several women were practically pushed inside the boats by the crew itself for fear of losing valuable minutes. There were also firm decisions in the opposite direction. Some insisted on staying. Among them was the wife of Isidor Strauss, owner of a chain of stores. She refused to enter a boat alone and remained with her husband. Both took a seat in some chairs and waited without separating. They were not the only ones. A few women chose to remain with their partners despite the officers trying to convince them otherwise. The majority, however, accepted getting in. Each woman was escorted to the boat by some member of the crew or by an acquaintance who had offered to look after her since the start of the trip. At that time, it was customary for men to take charge of accompanying unaccompanied ladies, and that custom made it easier for many female passengers to have direct help to reach their boat. Several families were separated amid the noise and movement, which generated scenes of confusion as they sought to reunite before the boat descended. In the midst of the agitation, some women went down with restrained tears. Others maintained a surprising serenity. Some even asked for a moment to collect personal items or give something to whoever was staying behind. There was one case in which a female passenger only agreed to get in after recovering a photograph she had left in her cabin. While the human decisions were taking place on deck, the state of the ship was worsening. Passengers who returned to their rooms to look for jewelry or dry clothes found water advancing through the hallways. Others ran into closed doors intended to prevent looting. The lights were still on, but every minute made it more evident that the bow was sinking. Around the boats, Thomas Andrews continued walking the deck, pressuring the women to get in without hesitation. He repeated that there was no time to lose. The direct tone of his words, added to his constant presence, accelerated the evacuation of several groups. The officers also began to feel the weight of the situation. Lightoller was urgently sent to collect weapons for fear that the tension might grow. Then he quickly returned to his post to continue supervising the loading of the boats. The increasing incline of the ship was noticeable, and some passengers stumbled when trying to get into the boats. There were falls, stumbles, and improvised rescues. In one case, a woman fell between the hull and the boat and was saved by people who grabbed her ankle before she sank. Despite these difficulties, the boats continued descending one after another. On the port side, Lightoller maintained the strict order. Only women and children, with a single exception, a passenger expert in navigation who agreed to descend by a rope to help crew one of the boats. On the starboard side, Murdoch allowed some men to get in if there was space left after embarking women. In that way, several first-class passengers managed to secure a place. Some even brought pets or contracted companions during the trip. The crew acted quickly despite the scarcity of sailors. The best men were already busy, and many others were performing crucial tasks in other parts of the ship. This forced the rationing of crew presence in each boat, which generated protests from below. Some boats descended with a single sailor in charge of maneuvering. In third class, the advance towards the boats was chaotic. Many passengers did not know the correct path and did not speak English. The hallways were a labyrinth of doors and changes in level that normally separated the zones by category. Several groups needed direct escort. The person in charge of guiding them had to make 2 very long trips up to the boat deck, crossing steep ladders and first-class areas that were not designed for the passage of so many people. Many refused to leave due to fear or confusion, and others tried to follow them without authorization. Not everyone managed to find the exit. Some ran in circles. Others were detained by barriers that had not been opened. Even so, several passengers found alternative paths by climbing cranes or emergency stairs. Necessity led them to look for any possible link between decks. The employees of the first-class restaurant were in the worst situation. They were not official crew, and they were not passengers either. That intermediate position left them without clear access to the boats. Only a few managed to get upstairs disguised among passengers. In the machine zone, no one was thinking of fleeing. The engineers, stokers, and electricians continued maintaining the pumps and the ship's energy. Temperatures were rising, steam was condensing in the air, and some compartments were already filtering water through the floor plates. Despite that, they continued at their posts, trying to gain minutes so that the rest could evacuate. From the boats that were already in the sea, the survivors observed the Titanic illuminated from end to end. The music kept playing, and the ship's silhouette stood out against the clear sky, although everyone could see the bow getting lower and lower. The contrast was disturbing, the splendor of a ship completely lit up, but slowly sinking in front of them. At a distance, the groups rowed or moved away awkwardly. Some boats received orders to head toward the light of a ship they saw on the horizon. Others waited for new instructions while the officers continued launching rockets. On the bridge, the captain confirmed to an officer that, according to Andrews, little more than 1 hour remained. Aboard the Californian, an apprentice and an officer counted the rockets without understanding their true nature. To them it was strange, but not conclusive. From the Titanic, they kept insisting with light signals and rockets, seeking someone on the other side of the sea to respond. The minutes advanced, the ship continued tilting, and the boats continued separating. The evacuation was underway, but time was running out. Final attempts, the struggle to gain minutes. The pressure in the wireless room became heavier as the early morning progressed. The signals arriving from other ships continued to show a disturbing incomprehension. At 1:25 post-meridium, the Olympic wanted to know if the course was oriented toward the south to meet them. The answer was direct. No displacement was possible. The priority was to get the women out in the boats. Then the Frankfurt insisted with questions that, for the operators, revealed how little the others understood the real urgency. The confusion was so evident that irritation finally erupted. The situation no longer admitted courtesies or patience. Meanwhile, Captain Smith's occasional presence in the radio room showed the growing fragility of the ship. He reported that the power was beginning to lose strength and that the remaining time was minimal. The most serious news came when he confirmed that the water had reached the boiler zone. This led the operator Phillips to transmit a desperate warning to the Carpathia, begging them to speed up as much as possible. The room remained lit, but the atmosphere became more oppressive. Bride placed a coat over Phillips's shoulders and managed to adjust a lifebelt to him, although even that task became difficult due to the limited space and the tension that saturated everything. When Phillips went out for a moment to observe the deck, he returned with a distraught face. He spoke of the scene as something very strange, and it was. Toward the bow, the water already covered the entire lower section and was advancing toward the white structures that still protruded above the surface. The incline had increased enough to force the men on deck to lean on the railings. In the midst of that thick silence, the order was heard to concentrate the weight on one side to try to balance the hull. For a few seconds, the ship seemed to respond and become more stable, but it was a deceptive relief. The maneuvers continued. Some crew members prepared the remaining boats, others tried to cut ropes with improvised tools. Every task had to be done quickly and without margin for error. From one of the lower levels, the sound of water ascending the emergency stairs became a permanent reminder that the interior was being lost section by section. Even the appearance of loose objects in the corridors, such as luggage or tableware displaced by the incline, made it evident that the ship's interior was being violently disordered. The tension also spread among those seeking a place in the last boats. Many had delayed their departure during the first hour, but the panorama changed when they saw the front railings disappear under the water. Several crew members began to make decisions without waiting for superior instructions. At different points on the ship, spaces were opened by force, passenger lines were reorganized, and any kind of access that allowed the evacuation to continue was improvised. Haste dominated the movements. In the central zone, the descent of a boat caused an unexpected confrontation. Some men tried to enter, taking advantage of the confusion, but they were forcefully pushed away by those guarding the procedure. It was a tense moment that made it clear how fragile order was when the deck tilted more and time ran out. The scene was not repeated in the same way it had happened before. Now the urgency was so high that everything was resolved in seconds, without discussions or prolonged warnings. As the night progressed, the officers themselves began to show signs of extreme tiredness. Their clothes were damp, the wind was increasingly cold, and breathing became short due to the slope of the floor. The electric light fluctuated, sometimes sharp, sometimes weak, as if vibrating with the rhythm of the water filtering into the lower compartments. The music, which was still playing somewhere on the ship, became a distant echo that contrasted with what was already happening a few meters away. The descent of boat number 4 took longer than expected due to unforeseen obstacles in the lower structure. When its loading could finally begin, the general feeling among those present was one of contained bewilderment. The ship had lowered so much that the large side windows were very close to sea level, and inside some luxury cabins' furniture dragged by internal currents could be seen. The sight was overwhelming for those who still doubted the seriousness of the situation. The preparation of the last boat continued in an even more tense atmosphere. The red lighting that stained part of the deck evidenced the instability of the electrical systems. The dishes crashing on lower levels marked a brusque rhythm that broke any illusion of control. The officers organized a human cordon around the final boat, aware that it was the last possible opportunity. The women who were waiting passed one by one, while some children were handed over by trembling arms to the sailors who settled them inside. The scene acquired a silent character that radically contrasted with the previous noise. No one raised their voice. Even the steps sounded muffled, as if the entire ship was holding its breath. In that climate, the farewell of several men who would not attempt to get in was no longer expressed with words. A gesture, a brief squeeze on the forearm, or a head movement sufficed. The majority remained still, watching the last boat pull away while the hull continued to sink. In another section of the deck, two men who had spent the night helping with different maneuvers found a completely empty space. The walkway that hours earlier was full now looked deserted. Upon advancing a few steps, the sea burst in without warning, covering their shoes and ascending up their boots. The icy water forced them to react immediately. The option of waiting had disappeared. When they saw a boat slide down the side, they jumped without thinking, falling between rope and wood, aware that there would be no other opportunity. While this was happening, the distance between the ship and the boats already launched grew rapidly. From there, the survivors could observe how the incline increased and how the lights trembled without order. The figure of the ship, gigantic hours earlier, seemed to shrink as the bow disappeared beneath the surface. The silence that enveloped the sea made the sounds that still came from inside the hull seem strange. Bangs, creaking, brief bursts produced by materials giving way under the weight. In the wireless room, Bride listened as Phillips continued transmitting everything the battery allowed. The signals were weaker, but they were still arriving. The idea of abandoning the post was not acceptable to either of them. They continued communicating until the power finally ran out. When the room went into semi-darkness, the only thing heard was the sound of water advancing at some point on the lower deck. Both adjusted their life belts and went out onto the deck for the last time. Outside, the general view no longer gave rise to doubts. The ship had lost the straight line it had maintained for almost all the night. The angle was so pronounced that those who remained had to hold on to any vertical surface to avoid sliding. The funnels leaned like defeated columns. Even so, no screaming dominated the scene. Everyone moved fast and in silence, guided by the instinct to find a point of support. The boats pulling away continued observing until the glow of the ship's lights ceased to be uniform. Suddenly, everything was plunged into a sequence of deep sounds, as if the interior were splitting in several directions. Afterward, an absolute silence arrived. Those who were far away only saw how darkness replaced the figure of the ship, while the sea closed over the last visible section. Surviving in the darkness, the sea after the sinking. When the last boat was lost in the darkness, the Titanic was enveloped in a strange silence. The bustle of the previous minutes vanished, and the people who were still aboard grouped together in the center of the ship, moving away from the edges. On the high part, Jack Thayer remained next to Milton Long. The two observed the movement of the hull, using an empty davit as a reference to calculate how the sinking was progressing. From there, they saw the desperate attempts to free the two collapsible boats on the roof of the officers' quarters. Sometimes they shared messages for their families. Other times they simply remained silent. Thayer thought about his whole life, about what he had lived and what he would never get to experience, while the images of his parents and siblings occupied his mind. A few steps away, Colonel Gracie noticed that he was running out of breath, a sensation that took him by surprise. He believed it was time to mentally say goodbye to his home. In the wireless telegraph cabin, Phillips continued at his post, trying to keep the equipment alive despite the power loss. Bride accompanied him, observing how people searched for vests in the nearby spaces. At 2:05 post-meridium, Captain Smith entered the room and spoke to them calmly. He told them that they had already fulfilled their duty and that it was time to take care of themselves. Phillips continued working a few moments more, but the captain insisted that they retire. Smith returned to the deck and walked among small groups, repeating to several crew members that every man should look out for himself. Some took him literally and jumped directly into the sea. The Baker Belford threw himself in a sitting position to reduce the impact and felt a stinging cold upon touching the water. Greaser Scott tried to slide down a rope, failed, and fell fully, although he managed to survive. Several managed to reach Boat 4, which was still close. Others, like Cunningham, also managed to swim toward a boat. However, the majority decided to stay. Lightoller observed that Hemming, who should have left in an earlier boat, was still helping to free the collapsibles. Two young waiters waited without haste, commenting on how much the vessel could resist. A group of bellboys rested a little further on, and the gym instructor refused to put on his vest because he preferred to swim without weight. The musical ensemble remained in its place, playing cheerful melodies despite the increasing incline. Some passengers also chose to act on their own. Frederick Hoyt helped his wife get into collapsible D, jumped into the sea, and swam until he found the boat while they were rowing. In other sectors, men and women walked in silence. Several first-class acquaintances stayed together in small groups. Further away, the Strauss couple remained seated on a deck chair. Thayer and Long debated whether it was prudent to jump. Long did not feel ready for it, and Thayer, a good swimmer, hesitated to leave him alone. As the vessel sank, some third-class passengers managed to advance to the high deck. Others headed to the stern, which was beginning to rise. Abel Seth, who had spent a large part of the night in the stern area with relatives and two young people, was led toward first class when an officer opened an access. There he waited with the hope of finding a boat. Everything was occupied. Along with his cousin and his brother-in-law, he decided to stay in that part despite the discomfort of being in a forbidden area. They even heard Mr. Strauss ask his wife to get into a boat without success. Inside the ship, the scene was just as shocking. The lounges were empty, but the lights were still on. The a la carte restaurant looked crooked by the incline and some candelabras had fallen. In the Louis XV lounge and the Palm Court, there was no one left. The contrast between those elegant rooms and the absolute calm was striking. In the smoking lounge, the builder Thomas Andrews was alone with his unused vest on a table. A waiter asked him if he would try to save himself, but Andrews did not answer. He continued looking toward the stern without moving a muscle. Outside, some people prayed with the priest Biles, others remained motionless. At that hour, several thoughts weighed on them: the ice warnings received earlier, the sudden drop in temperature, the warnings that did not reach the bridge, decisions made during the day, and small signs that now seemed like warnings. Each one mentally reviewed what had happened. In the radio cabin, Phillips adjusted the spark so that the signal would be clearer. Bride checked the aft cabin and gathered the money that was there. Upon returning, he found an unconscious woman whom they gave water until she regained her breath. When he returned to the room, he observed something strange. A stoker was trying to take Phillips's vest. Bride reacted immediately, wrestling with him while Phillips hit the intruder until he was unconscious. Shortly after, they heard water entering through the stairwell of the upper level. Phillips shouted that they had to leave immediately, and both escaped without looking back. Bride headed toward the collapsible boats on the roof of the cabins. Several crew members tried to free them so that they would float upon sinking. Lightoller, Murdoch, Hemming, Brown, Hurst and others worked tirelessly. On the port side, Hemming tried to fix a problem on the rope of Boat B, but Moody, from above, told him that they did not need the rigging because they would leave the boat on the deck for it to float. Hemming gave up, threw himself into the water and swam. The boat fell upside down. To starboard, the situation with Boat A was just as complicated. The inclination toward port made it almost impossible to push the boat to the edge. While everyone was pulling the boats, the bridge went under the water at 2:15 post-meridiem, and a wave advanced across the deck. Gracie and Clinch Smith began a race toward the stern, but a group of men and women emerged from the lower decks, blocking their path. At that moment, the band changed the rhythm, and the hymn Autumn was heard extending through the icy air. At the bow, a woman asked Peter Daly for help. He replied that she could only save herself by her own means, but he ended up accompanying her when she jumped. At the same time, a wave swept Brown away when he tried to free Boat A. Seeing that it floated, he jumped inside before being expelled again by the current. Lightoller understood that if he continued advancing toward the stern, he would only delay the inevitable. He turned and threw himself into the sea. A current pressed him against the grating of a vent, but a gust of hot air pushed him out and he managed to escape by swimming. Bride was also swept away, clinging to a support of Boat B, which was still upside down. Several men held onto the edge and the boat ended up floating inverted. Gracie was swept away by the wave, grabbed onto the railing and finally managed to surface, but Smith disappeared. Meanwhile, Abelseth remained in the stern area. With the increase in the incline, he heard creaking and muffled thuds. The slope caused many people to fall and slide directly into the water. He and his relatives clung to a rope. When the sea level was a few meters away, they jumped together, although they were separated immediately. The majority of those who were on deck were trapped among objects, furniture and fragments that were breaking off. The roar was constant. The lights flickered, went out, returned, and then disappeared. A lantern remained lit on the stern mast as the last point of light. The structure roared while the incline reached the most extreme angle. When the forefunnel fell, several swimmers were trapped, although some managed to avoid it. The fall of the funnel displaced the overturned raft where Lightoller, Bride and others were, moving them away from the hull. The stern remained totally vertical, and all the internal mechanisms broke loose in a chaotic rain. The ship seemed frozen in that unreal posture before beginning the final descent. In the boats, some could not look. Ismay hid his face, Stengel turned his back, and several women only heard the silence that followed the last sound of the hull sinking. At 2:20 post-meridium, the ship disappeared beneath the surface. Those who were in the boats could barely process what they had seen. In the distance, the crew of the Californian observed the end without truly understanding what was happening. For them, the succession of rockets had never had a clear meaning. Now they only saw the empty night where an illuminated silhouette had been before. The horror dawn, surviving in the emptiness of the Titanic. When the Titanic disappeared beneath the surface at 2:20 post-meridium, the sea was covered by a thin mist and a field of debris floating aimlessly. From boat number 1, Lady Duff Gordon observed the emptiness and murmured to her secretary, "There went your beautiful nightgown." The comment marked the beginning of a dawn in which not only a ship had been lost, but also the confidence in an era that believed it dominated technology and the ocean. The catastrophe transformed maritime regulations forever. Since that night, no one would sail through an ice zone without taking precautions or blindly trusting in engineering. Permanent radio surveillance was established, and the obligation for every ship to carry enough boats for everyone. It was the end of a way of traveling and of the idea that a vessel could be indestructible. While these consequences did not yet exist in the minds of the survivors, chaos still reigned on the sea. Most of those who had remained in the water tried to cling to any object that floated. The temperature was so low that every minute reduced the strength of the swimmers. Some tried to stay on planks, others fought against desperate men who unintentionally dragged down anyone who came near. Among the wreckage, 2 hopes emerged. Collapsibles A and B, dragged by the wave caused by the fall of the funnel. On collapsible A, about 20 people clung to the water-covered walls. They offered neither help nor resistance, only repeating one plea: "Don't overturn the boat." Collapsible B, overturned, received more men. Lightoller managed to climb onto the keel along with other survivors. Jack Thayer also arrived, pushed there by the wave. Harold Bride emerged from beneath the boat, trapped under the structure until he could surface. Others sought a space, among them a British passenger with a fur coat who, despite the weight, managed to stay afloat and climb up. Each new addition caused the boat to sink a little more, until the line between staying alive and capsizing became almost non-existent. When the structure was already full, those who approached received desperate warnings. Some were hit with oars, others swam around trying to find a safe spot. Among those who approached, one had a firm voice that encouraged the others without asking to climb aboard. Many believed it was Captain Smith himself, although no one could confirm it later. On the overturned boat, Lightoller organized the men to keep their balance. He made them stand up, form a double row, and move to the rhythm of each wave. In this way, they prevented the collapsible from sinking definitively. In the darkness, some shared stories of the ship's final moments. Others simply tried to resist the temperature that bit like needles. Meanwhile, in the boats that had managed to move away, there was another atmosphere. In the small flotilla assembled by 5th Officer Lowe, the silence was broken by the decision that no one else dared to make: return to search for survivors. Louvre organized boats 10, 12, 4, and D, distributed the passengers, and formed a team capable of handling the oars. When he believed there would no longer be a risk of being swamped, he launched toward the field of debris. By then, almost 1 hour had passed since the sinking. The water had done its work. The screams had turned into whispers, and then nothing. Louvre only managed to rescue 4 people alive, of which 1 died shortly after. No other boat returned to the site of the shipwreck. The other boats remained immobile, many of them just a few hundred meters away. In some, the women implored to return, but the crew feared that the desperate shipwrecked people would overturn them. In others, discussions and hasty decisions reigned. Fear was stronger than duty. Even so, upon moving away from the Titanic, a strange calm spread over the people in the boats. Some spoke in a low voice, others contemplated the sky. A few looked at the shooting stars that crossed the night and wondered how they had survived. In one boat, a woman recalled an old belief: every falling star announces a death. Soon small interactions began that resembled a forced picnic. In Boat 3, a woman wrapped a baby while telling stories to distract herself. In Boat 13, the steward Ray distributed handkerchiefs to be used as hats. In several boats, first-class ladies shared blankets with third-class women. At the same time, some spent the night rowing. In Boat 6, the famous Mrs. Brown energetically directed the female passengers and organized a system for everyone to participate. However, not everything was solidarity. In some boats, fights broke out between passengers and crew. There were discussions about the course, about the use of blankets, and even about an alarm clock that a woman made ring in the middle of the early morning. In Boat 1, the gesture of Sir Cosmo Duff Gordon of handing over £5 to several crew members would later be interpreted as an attempt at bribery not to return to the site of the shipwreck, staining his reputation. On Collapsible B, the situation worsened every minute. The boat was slowly sinking as water entered through the edges. For many, the only force that kept them going was the hope of seeing lights on the horizon. The temperature rose and fell with each swell, and some men slipped and disappeared without anyone being able to help them. Lightoller insisted on maintaining the rhythm, forcing everyone to move in unison so as not to fall. Among those who managed to stay afloat was the baker Charles Jougan. His resistance to the cold was due to an improbable combination of alcohol, cold blood, and luck. After helping to load provisions and embark women, he had moved across different decks until the water engulfed him. He jumped without sinking and spent hours floating almost without feeling the cold until he reached Collapsible B, where he held onto the edge without attempting to climb aboard. Shortly after 3:30, a flash crossed the sky, then another and another more. The boats began to see lights advancing in the distance. A ship was approaching, firing rockets. It was the Carpathia. The boats responded as best they could, burning paper, lighting newspapers, waving lit walking sticks. Hope paved the way through the darkness. When the dawn stained the sea with warm colors, some were still asking about lost relatives. Others could barely speak. On Collapsible A, many were too weakened to react. For some, dawn arrived late. For others, it meant life. Thus ended the night that snatched the Titanic and marked the beginning of a different world, where the sea would no longer be entrusted to luck or the prestige of an era that had just sunk. Toward New York, the voices that reconstructed the tragedy. In the early morning of April the 15th, while the Titanic was sinking in the middle of the North Atlantic, the Carpathia was advancing toward the Mediterranean on a quiet night. Its passengers were sleeping when they began to notice a strange movement. Mrs. Anne Crane woke up to the smell of freshly brewed coffee, unusual at that hour. In another cabin, Miss Ann Peterson saw the lights on throughout the ship. Mr. Howard Chapin heard noise right above his cabin. They seemed to be untying a boat. Other passengers felt the vibration of the hull, the accelerated beating of the engines, and the cold that entered through the cracks. Captain Arthur Rostron had been sleeping just a few minutes before. But when the operator Harold Cottam delivered the message from the Titanic, he reacted immediately. He ordered the ship to turn, plotted a new course, and called the chief engineer. All steam power had to be directed to the engines. The heating was turned off, the hot water was cut off, and the ship began to demand every pound of pressure. The engines roared until they exceeded 17 knots, an unprecedented speed for the old transatlantic liner. Rostron organized the rescue operation with absolute precision. Boats ready to be lowered, electric lights arranged along the side, ropes, slings for children, nets, ladders and access points enabled. He ordered coffee for the entire crew, medical stations in every lounge, and thousands of blankets prepared for the survivors. He also gave instructions to keep the Carpathia's passengers in their cabins, preventing them from hindering the work. While the Carpathia was advancing, the operator Cottam tried to communicate with the Titanic. He received messages that showed a rapid deterioration. Sinking by the bow, the engine room is flooding, come as soon as possible. At 1:50 post-meridium, the last message arrived before the silence. After that, nothing more. Aboard the Carpathia, the passengers began to notice that the ship was racing at an almost dangerous speed. Some tried to look out onto the deck and were sent back to their rooms. Others exchanged rumors in low voices. No one knew what to look for in the darkness. Everyone imagined a damaged ship, but no one contemplated the idea of a total shipwreck. At 2:35 post-meridium, already close to the estimated position, a green flash appeared on the horizon. Rostron believed the Titanic was still afloat, but minutes later icebergs began to emerge. The Carpathia zigzagged between them, maintaining maximum speed. On deck, the service personnel tried to keep warm, joking, while the ship dodged masses of ice that shone under the stars. When dawn broke, Rostron found himself surrounded by icebergs. The Titanic was not there. Only then did the first lifeboat appear, illuminated by a flare. At 4:10 post-meridium, the Carpathia picked up the first survivor, Miss Elizabeth Allen. Her answer was brief. The Titanic has sunk. From that moment on, the boats began to appear everywhere. Some arrived with silent passengers, others with men singing to stay awake. There were boats full of women who had not said a word since the collision. On Collapsible B, the men had been trying for hours to balance themselves on the overturned structure. Lightoller, Thayer, Bride and the rest could barely stand. The arrival of boats 4 and 12 saved them just in time. Fifth Officer Lowe, the only one who had returned to the field of debris, brought with him the few survivors rescued from the water. Afterward, he found Collapsible A, flooded with people up to their knees in icy water. Only 13 people remained standing. Lowe took them onto his boat and left behind the empty Collapsible, which the sea would later turn into a floating tomb. The boats arrived in sequence, the 13 at 4:45 post-meridium, the 7 at 5:10 post-meridium, the 3 at 6 o'clock, the 1, the 4, the 10, the D, one after another. On deck, the Carpathia's passengers watched in silence, looking for familiar faces. Some received news they did not expect, others found relatives they believed lost. Billy Carter screamed desperately for his son until the child raised a huge hat and replied, "Here I am, father." Bruce Ismay climbed aboard in silence, trembling, repeating his name. He accepted neither food nor drink. Dr. McGee discreetly took him to his cabin, where he would remain isolated throughout the trip. On the deck of the Carpathia, the mix of the survivors' clothing was striking: fur coats, nightgowns, pajamas, kimonos, wet shoes, blankets, and improvised garments. They had left a luxury transatlantic liner and arrived at another ship with nothing more than the clothes on their backs. Toward 8:30 post-meridium, the last boat arrived, number 12, overloaded with almost 70 people. Every wave threatened to overturn it. Lightoller directed the rowers to maintain balance until they were finally able to moor alongside the Carpathia. They had spent more than 6 hours in the open. With everyone aboard, Rostron decided the destination, New York. Halifax was closer, but the ice blocked the way. The Azores were too far away. Furthermore, the survivors needed immediate attention. The idea of transferring them to the Olympic seemed inconceivable. It was the Titanic's sister ship, and it would have been a traumatic image. Before retiring, Rostron made one last tour of the shipwreck area. There was barely a trace of the Titanic left. Pieces of cork, chairs, panels, cushions, life jackets, and a single visible body. Then he ordered a religious service. The ship moved slowly while a priest read prayers, and the survivors remained silent. Meanwhile, in New York, the news had caused confusion throughout the morning of April the 15th. The first editions of the newspapers spoke of a minor accident. The vice president of the White Star Line insisted that the Titanic was unsinkable. But as evening fell, the rumors grew. Finally, a message from the Olympic confirmed the inevitable. The Titanic had sunk and only survivors remained in the boats. Families went to the shipping company's offices. Some found their relatives' names on the preliminary lists. Others only found silence. The newspapers began to create theories: explosions, giant cracks, dense fog, miracles, and supposed heroic actions. Invented stories emerged, from dogs saving boats to men operating non-existent radios. The press filled the information void with imagination. On April the 18th, the wait ended. The Carpathia arrived in New York under the rain. Tens of thousands of people crowded the port. The Titanic's boats were unloaded first, converted into objects of morbid curiosity and memory. Then the survivors descended. Some walked alone, others were supported by the crew. Each face told a different story. During the following days, the press, families, and authorities began to reconstruct the facts. Among speculations and testimonies, the first myths that would endure also appeared. The music that kept playing, the nearer my God to thee, the captain's supposed calm, or the supposed suicides. Some accounts were honest, others arose from the human need to give shape to the horror. The global reaction was immediate. Flags at half-mast, events suspended, entire cities in mourning. In Southampton, where most of the crew lived, a single street lost 20 sailors. Governments sent condolences. Complete families were broken. The cold facts ended up prevailing. The Titanic was sailing at about 22.5 knots, carried 2,224 people, and only 705 survived. The water temperature was -2 degrees Celsius. The first boat was lowered at 12:45 post-meridium, and the last at 1:55 post-meridium. The ship broke up around 2:18 post-meridium and disappeared 2 minutes later. The story advanced, but for those who were on the Carpathia there were no statistics, only exhaustion. Some sent their first telegrams. Others could not speak. Several women refused to take coffee or a coat. "Go away, we have just seen our husbands die," 2 of them told Mrs. Ogden. While the engines set the rhythm, the Carpathia moved away from the icefield. The survivors occupied chairs, wrapped the children in blankets, and listened to the constant hum of the gears. Many tried to understand why they had lived when so many had been left behind. No one had answers. The sun advanced over the Atlantic while the Carpathia continued its journey toward New York, carrying with it the memory of the most shocking tragedy of its time.